Eleanor Whitmore picked up the dollar bill her husband's mistress had just thrown onto her dinner plate, folded it once against her knee, and slipped it into her glove without a word. The laughter was still rising around the table when she stood. Clara Beaumont was still smiling when Eleanor walked past her close enough to smell her perfume. Nathaniel was still raising his glass when his wife stepped through the front door of the estate he believed he owned. He had no idea she held the deed. Subscribe and stay until the last word, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The dollar bill was still warm from Clara Beaumont's glove when it landed on Eleanor's plate. It settled across the untouched food with a soft, papery whisper, and the sound of it, that small and weightless sound, cut through every conversation in the room. 43 people heard it land. 43 people turned to look. Eleanor did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and her eyes on the banknote, and she thought with a clarity that surprised even herself. There it is. There is the thing I have been waiting 3 years to see. Not the dollar. The contempt behind it. Out in the open at last where it could be used. Clara Beaumont stood on the other side of the table with her chin lifted and her pale green silk catching the candlelight, and her smile arranged in the particular way of a woman who wanted an audience and knew she had one. She was 23 years old, and she had never once in her life been made to feel small in a room, and it showed in every line of her posture. For a woman with no family name worth speaking of, Clara said clearly, pleasantly, the way you'd comment on the weather. No property of her own, and no real standing in this county, I'd say that's more than adequate provision. Someone laughed, short and sharp from the far table. Then Harriet Ashford, Nathaniel's mother, 60 years old, and constructed entirely of good breeding and cold judgment, made the low musical sound she deployed in place of a smile when she felt a situation had resolved itself satisfactorily. Then Nathaniel laughed. He was standing at the head of the room with his wine glass raised, and he laughed with his whole chest, the way he used to laugh at things Eleanor said in the early months before he'd stopped listening to her entirely. The laugh landed in her sternum like a stone dropped from a height. She had not expected it to still hurt. She picked up the banknote. She turned it once, twice, examined it as though it were a thing of some interest, and then she folded it along the center crease and slipped it inside her left glove against her wrist. Slow, deliberate, the gesture of a woman filing something away for later. She stood. She did not push her chair back with force. She did not raise her voice. She smoothed the front of her dress. Plain gray cotton, no lace, no adornment. Chosen this morning with deliberate precision, and she walked toward the door. "Do take care," Clara called after her, still smiling. "The road north is quite long for a woman traveling without protection." Eleanor walked through the door and did not look back. She had learned long ago that you only look back when you're afraid of losing something. She was not afraid. She knew exactly what she was carrying. The carriage was where she had told James to have it, far end of the drive, plain black, no family crest on the door. She had given that instruction 2 days ago before the dinner, before she had been entirely certain of what the evening would produce. She had been nearly certain. Clara Beaumont had not disappointed her. James held the door without a word. He was 60 years old, had driven for the Whitmore family since Eleanor's father was a young man, and he had a quality she valued above almost everything else in another person. He understood when silence was the appropriate response to a situation. "Richmond," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The carriage moved down the gravel drive. Eleanor looked out the window at the lit face of Ashford Hall, her candles burning in every window, her furniture arranged in every room, her taste visible in every choice of fabric and flower, and she felt for one precise and honest moment the full weight of what she was leaving. Not Nathaniel. She had already left Nathaniel in every way that mattered long before tonight. The house. She was leaving the house. She pressed her left wrist against her side and felt the edge of the folded banknote through the fabric of her glove, and she thought about her father's voice. "Property is not a thing you wear on your face, Eleanor. It is a thing you hold in your hands, quietly, until the moment you need it." She had been holding it quietly for 3 years. The lights of Ashford Hall disappeared behind the tree line. She turned away from the window. Mercer's offices on Carey Street were lit when she arrived. One lamp on the landing, One in the inner office, the particular arrangement she had asked him to maintain, on evenings when she might need to come late. He had maintained it without question for 2 years. Jonathan Mercer was 70 years old, had outlasted 3 governors and a war, and understood that the law practiced with patience was the most reliable instrument of justice available to people who could not afford to be loud. Howe was sitting behind his desk when she entered. 2 associates arranged to his left, a leather document case open on the table. He rose. "Madam Whitmore," he said. She had asked him in the early months to call her Ashford. He had nodded and continued to call her Whitmore. She had stopped correcting him. "Tell me exactly where we stand," she said, taking the chair across from him. "Not the overview, every detail." Mercer settled back. He placed both hands flat on the document case. "The forgeries have been confirmed by 3 independent examiners," he said. "Harrison in Richmond, Colville in Philadelphia, and a document specialist from the Federal Circuit who came down at my request last month. 3. I wanted it to be 3, he said. 1 man's opinion is an argument. 3 men's opinion is a fact." She nodded. "Continue. The instruments your husband filed with the county recorder, the management transfer, the amended estate authority. The witnessed signatures are fabrications. Every one of them. The signatures attributed to your late father were produced no earlier than 1812, which is to say 3 years after his death." He paused to let that settle. "The Whitmore Trust instruments, the originals, are in this case in my hand, and they are entirely in order. They name you as sole heir and sole legal authority. They have named you so since 1802. When can you file to void the Ashford instruments?" "I have been ready to file for 4 months." Something shifted in Eleanor's chest. "4 months," she said. "I was waiting for you to give me the word." He looked at her steadily across the desk. "You told me to wait until you were certain you had what you needed. I assumed you would tell me when that moment arrived." "I needed the dinner," she said. A pause. "I beg your pardon. I needed a public act, a witnessed act. Something that 40 people could confirm later if anyone chose to question the sequence of events." She reached into her left glove and set the folded banknote on the surface of his desk. "Clara Beaumont placed that on my plate in front of 43 witnesses tonight, and told the room I had no standing, no family, and no claim to anything." Mercer looked at the dollar bill. He looked at it for a long moment. "And your husband?" he said carefully. "His response?" He laughed. Mercer picked up the banknote. He unfolded it, examined it briefly, refolded it, and set it to one side with the deliberate tidiness of a man classifying evidence. "That was not wise of him," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It was not. Then we have everything." He opened the document case and drew out the top filing. "I will be at the recorder's office when it opens in the morning. You should know once this is filed it becomes a matter of public record. The Ashford claim will be challenged in open court. There will be no quiet resolution." "I am not interested in a quiet resolution." Mercer looked at her. In 30 years of practice, he had sat across from a great many people at turning points in their affairs, and he had developed a reliable sense for those who understood what they were starting. Eleanor Whitmore had understood it for years. That was what had made her difficult to advise and ultimately impossible to outmaneuver. She had simply waited longer than anyone expected a woman in her position to wait. "There is one more thing," he said. She waited. "The Ashford family attorney, a man named Brent Holt, out of Fredericksburg, he is good. He will not concede the forgery argument easily. He will challenge the chain of custody on the trust documents. He will argue that your concealment of the Whitmore identity constitutes a form of fraud in the original marriage arrangement." He kept his voice level. "He will be wrong on every point, but he will make noise, and noise in a courthouse has a way of creating doubt in people who should know better. Can he delay the proceedings? He can try. A beat. He will fail, but it will not be immediate, and it will not be quiet." Eleanor was silent for a moment. Outside, a cart moved along Carey Street, wheels loud on the stones. The city going to sleep around them unaware. "Mercer," she said. "Madam, my husband stood in front of 43 people tonight and announced the beginning of his future." She kept her voice level. Exact. He used that word specifically. Future. He described it as something that no longer had any old arrangements in it. She looked at the document case. I would like his future to begin exactly as he described it, without any arrangements that belong to me. Mercer held her gaze. Then we will make certain of that, he said. File in the morning, Eleanor said. She stood. And Mercer, send word to the Philadelphia office. I want the banking instruments confirmed by the end of the week. Already done, he said. I sent the letter 3 days ago. She paused at that, looked at him. I have been your family's counsel for 40 years, Madam Whitmore, he said with the quietest possible satisfaction. I have learned to anticipate. The Whitmore townhouse on Grace Street was 3 streets from Mercer's office and a world away from Ashford Hall in every sense that mattered to Eleanor. It was small. 4 rooms and a kitchen and a garden in the back with oaks her mother had planted. It had no ballroom, no imported lace on the tables, no silver candle holders that caught the light and threw it back in ways designed to impress. What it had was 70 years of her family's continuous occupation and a housekeeper named Martha Slade, who had been with the Whitmores since before Eleanor was born, and who, when Eleanor came through the door at 10:30, simply took her coat and said, "There's cold chicken and the fire's lit." "Thank you, Martha." "Will you be staying?" "Yes." Martha hung the coat without further comment. She had a quality similar to James, a fundamental absence of unnecessary speech at necessary moments. Eleanor had always found it one of the most restful things in the world. She went into the sitting room and stood by the fire. The house was quiet in a way Ashford Hall had never been, even in its empty hours. Ashford Hall was always performing, always arranged for the impression it was meant to make. This house simply existed. It had been existing for her family for 3 generations, and it would go on existing after whatever came next. She pulled off her left glove and looked at her wrist where the dollar bill had pressed against her skin. There was a faint crease in the skin. Nothing more. She thought about Nathaniel in the moment before she had walked out that half-second, when his laugh had faded and something crossed his face that might have been surprise. Only might. She wasn't certain. She had not let herself look long enough to be certain, because she had not trusted herself in that moment to look at his face and remain composed. That was the one thing she had not told Mercer. The one detail she had not been able to fully resolve in 3 years of patient preparation, that some part of her had still, even tonight, been hoping he would do something different. Say something different. That some version of Nathaniel she had believed in briefly at the beginning would surface in the moment of crisis and show itself to be real. He had not. He had laughed with his whole chest. She pressed her fingers against the crease on her wrist and held them there for a moment. Then she went to the small writing table in the corner, sat down, drew out paper, and began to write the letter she had been composing in her mind for 6 months. It was addressed to a woman named Dorothea Vance in Philadelphia, a widow, a property owner in her own right, a woman who sat on the advisory board of 2 charitable institutions, and who had corresponded with Eleanor's mother for 20 years before Eleanor's mother died. Eleanor had never met her in person. She had been corresponding with her for 2 years. The letter was not about the legal case. The letter was about what came after the legal case. Eleanor had spent 3 years building the argument that would recover what was hers. She had also spent those 3 years thinking about what she intended to do with it once she had it back. The Whitmore land. 41,000 acres did not need to be simply a name on a deed. It could be a thing that worked. A thing that did something in the world beyond demonstrating that Eleanor Whitmore had not been defeated. She wrote for an hour. The fire burned down to coals. Martha came once with tea, said it without comment, and withdrew. When Eleanor finished the letter, she sealed it, addressed it, and set it on the corner of the desk for the Morning Post. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, looking at the writing on the envelope. Mrs. Dorothea Vance, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She thought about the oak trees in the garden outside. Her mother's trees planted 30 years ago from seedlings. They were large now. You could not look at them and imagine them small. Her mother had said once that the best things you built looked in the end as though they had always been there, as though the world had simply arranged itself around them. She had been talking about the garden. Eleanor had always suspected she meant something else. Nathaniel Ashford did not sleep well. He would not have admitted this. He was not in his own estimation a man troubled by conscience. Conscience, in his experience, was what people invoked when they lacked the clarity of purpose to make difficult decisions and live with them. He had made his decisions. He was living with them. He was not troubled. He was simply awake at 2 a.m. in the rented rooms above the printing house where he'd been staying, while the estate transfer paperwork moved through the recorder's office with a glass of whiskey he had not touched, and a view of the street that was offering him nothing useful. The dinner had gone exactly as planned. Better than planned in some respects. Clara had been sharper than he'd expected, and the room had responded correctly. And by morning, every significant family in the county would know that the Ashford arrangement had been formally concluded and the new alignment was in place. That was what mattered. Visible, public, established. He had not expected Eleanor to be so quiet about it. He had expected at some level, he would not entirely examine tears. Or at minimum words. She had always had precise and pointed words when she chose to use them. He had been ready for words. He had his own prepared. He had thought through the argument. They would have the shape of it, the way he would hold the position, and she would eventually exhaust herself against it, and the thing would be resolved. She had not given him the argument. She had picked up the dollar bill and put it in her glove and walked out. He turned the whiskey glass in his hand and told himself it did not matter. She was gone. She had no legal standing to contest anything. The management transfer had been filed. The signatures witnessed, the instruments recorded. Holt had reviewed everything 3 times. Everything was in order. He told himself that with some precision. He was still telling himself that when he heard the clock in the hall strike 3, and then 4, and then the earliest pale suggestion of morning begin to show at the edge of the curtains, and he had not slept. The message arrived at 11:30 the following morning. Nathaniel was in the study, reviewing the timber survey, when his man came in with the writer's note, a sealed letter from Holt's office, delivered by hand marked urgent, in Holt's own writing across the front. He opened it. He read it. He read it again. He set it on the desk in front of him and looked at it. From the next room, he heard Clara moving, heard the particular sound of her instructions to the household staff. The voice she used, that had begun to have in recent weeks a proprietary quality that he had found pleasing. He heard it now, and it registered somewhere at the edge of his awareness, and no further, because what was in front of him on the desk was using up the majority of his attention. The Whitmore Trust instruments have been filed against the Ashford management claim by a Jonathan Mercer on behalf of Eleanor Whitmore, sole, named heir, under the trust charter of 1789. The filing occurred this morning at 9:15. The Ashford instruments are formally contested. You are required to appear. He stopped reading. He stood up. He went to the window. He looked at the street. Eleanor Whitmore. He said her name in his mind, and something happened in his chest that was not a feeling. He had a clear name for. Not fear. Not quite. A sudden awareness of the shape of a thing he had not previously been able to see, as though the room had shifted slightly on its axis, and he was looking at the furniture from an unfamiliar angle and realizing it was arranged differently than he had believed. Whitmore. He knew the name. Every man of property in Virginia knew the name. The Whitmore Trust was not a thing you encountered daily, but it was a thing you knew existed, the way you knew certain mountains existed large and distant and not immediately relevant to your life. 41,000 acres in Virginia and the territories. A Philadelphia banking charter. A name that appeared on the older deeds in the county, like a watermark always there if you held the page to the light. He had married a woman named Eleanor. She had given her name as Eleanor Whitmore on the marriage certificate. He had not. He pressed his fist against the window frame. He had not asked. In 4 years of knowing her, in 3 years of marriage, he had not once asked Eleanor Whitmore what the Whitmore referred to. He had assumed it was her father's surname. A man of modest means, she had implied. A man who had left her little. He had assumed, and she had not corrected him, and he had been satisfied with his assumption, because a man who is looking for a wife of quiet manners and no inconvenient family complications Does not look carefully at the name she arrives with. He had not looked carefully. Nathaniel. Clara was in the doorway. She had heard the rider arrive. She had a particular sharpness in her expression, the one she got when information was circulating that she had not yet accessed. "What is it?" He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, and he thought about Eleanor picking up that dollar bill without a word, folding it against her knee, sliding it into her glove. He thought about the way she had smoothed the front of her dress before she stood. He thought about the fact that the carriage waiting for her at the end of the drive had not been one of his. He had not asked whose carriage it was. He had not asked because it had not seemed like a thing that required asking. "Get Holt," he said. "Now, tell him to come here." Clara took one step into the room. "Nathaniel what?" "Clara." His voice was not loud. It was very exact. "Get Holt." She looked at his face. Whatever she saw there, she turned and went without further question. Nathaniel turned back to the window. Eleanor Whitmore, sole named heir under the trust charter of 1789. He had knocked the inkwell off the desk without being aware of doing it. It was lying on its side on the floor, spreading black across the floorboards, and he was looking at it and thinking about a woman in plain gray cotton, walking through a doorway with her back straight, and 43 people's laughter following her out, and thinking about the one thing, the single thing that he could not account for. She had not looked back. Not once. Not for a single moment. Women who had nowhere to go looked back. Women who were walking away from everything they had looked back, because the looking was the last thing they owned. She had not looked back. And standing at his window with Holt's letter in his hand and the ink spreading across his floor. Nathaniel Ashford felt for the first time in 3 years the specific and vertiginous sensation of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions that were never in any particular true. At that exact moment, Eleanor was in the Grace Street garden with a second cup of tea, watching the morning light come through her mother's oaks. James had brought word an hour ago. She had listened. She had nodded. She had sent him back with 2 instructions. Bring the carriage around at 4 and say nothing to anyone about her plans for the afternoon. She had not asked about Nathaniel's face when the letter arrived. She did not need to. She reached into her pocket and touched the folded dollar bill she had moved there from her glove. Her glove this morning. She did not take it out. She simply felt the edge of it against her fingers. $1. They had given her $1 and believed that was the measure of what she was worth. They had stood in a room full of her own candles and laughed, and they had gone to sleep that night, satisfied that the future was arranged as they required it. The future was not arranged as they required it. She finished her tea. She set the cup down. She stood up from the garden chair and smoothed her dress gray cotton. Same dress, same precision, and she looked up at the oaks her mother had planted 30 years ago from seedlings too small to imagine becoming what they were now. The best things you built looked in the end as though they had always been there. Eleanor Whitmore walked back inside to write 3 more letters. She had a great deal of work to do, and she was at last ready to do it. The 3 letters went out with the morning post before Eleanor had finished her second cup of tea. She did not pace after sending them. She did not stand at the window watching the street the way women in her position were expected to, anxious, unmoored, measuring their worth by how quickly someone responded to them. She sat at the small writing table and opened the Whitmore Trust ledger that Mercer had sent over 6 months ago at her request, and she began reading it the way her father had taught her to read it, from the back, where the numbers told the truth before the words had a chance to arrange themselves. 41,214 acres, 14 active land leases, 3 commercial timber agreements, 1 banking charter in Philadelphia, established 1791, operating under the Whitmore family name, with a capital reserve that would have made Nathaniel Ashford's hands shake had he known it existed. He had not known it existed. That was the part that still astonished her. Not that he had deceived her, but how completely she had managed to maintain the deception, going the other direction. 3 years in the same house, the same bed, the same dinner table, and Nathaniel Ashford had never once looked at his wife with the particular focused curiosity that would have led him to the truth. He had looked at her and seen what he expected to see: a woman of modest background, quiet manners, no inconvenient family complications. He had seen what he was looking for. Men like Nathaniel always did. She closed the ledger when she heard the knock at the front door. Not a tentative knock, a deliberate one. 2 sharp raps, the knock of someone who had been here before and had not come to be turned away. Martha appeared in the sitting room doorway a moment later. "Mr. Mercer is here, ma'am, and he's brought someone." "Send them in." Mercer entered first, carrying the document case, and wearing the expression Eleanor had come to recognize as his version of controlled urgency. Everything in his face smooth, but something in the set of his shoulders that said the morning had moved faster than anticipated. Behind him came a younger man, no older than 30, with the kind of face that looked like it had spent considerable time outdoors, and the kind of eyes that looked like they spent equal time reading fine print. "Madam Whitmore," Mercer said, "the filing has been received and logged. You'll want to know what happened in the 2 hours after." "Sit down," she said. "Both of you." Mercer sat. The younger man remained standing, which told Eleanor something about his deference to Mercer and his own uncertainty about protocol. She gestured once toward the chair. He sat. "This is Daniel Carr," Mercer said. "He clerks for me. He was at the recorder's office this morning when the Ashford response came in." Eleanor looked at Carr. "How fast?" Carr blinked. "Ma'am, how fast did the Ashford response come in after you filed?" He shifted forward in the chair. 2 hours and 11 minutes, he said. Mr. Holt arrived with 2 associates and a letter from Mr. Ashford demanding a stay of proceedings. The recorder told him there was nothing to stay, the filing was already logged and in order. Holt asked to see the trust instruments. The recorder told him they were not available for opposing counsel inspection at that stage. He paused. Holt was not pleased. "I imagine not," Eleanor said. "What did he argue?" "He argued 3 things." Carr counted on his fingers quickly like a man who had rehearsed this. First, that the Whitmore trust instruments were outdated and had been superseded by the management transfer your husband filed in March. Second, that your concealment of the Whitmore identity in the original marriage arrangement constitutes a misrepresentation that voids your standing as heir. Third, he stopped. "Say it," Eleanor said. Third, that a woman acting without male guardianship cannot be the sole legal authority on a property dispute of this scale under Virginia law as currently written. The room was quiet. Eleanor looked at Mercer. Mercer looked back at her with the expression of a man who had anticipated this argument and had been waiting for the appropriate moment to address it. "He's wrong on all 3, she said. It was not a question. "He is wrong on all 3, Mercer confirmed. "The management transfer is void because it was built on forged instruments that supersedes any subsequent filing. Your concealment of your family identity is not misrepresentation under Virginia contract law. You were under no legal obligation to enumerate your assets prior to marriage, and Ashford's own attorneys failed to conduct due diligence, which is their error and not yours. And the guardianship argument." He allowed himself a brief pause. The Whitmore Trust was specifically chartered with female succession provisions in 1789. At your grandfather's insistence, precisely because he anticipated this argument would be made by precisely the kind of man who would eventually try to make it. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. "My grandfather thought of Holt." "Your grandfather thought of every Holt," Mercer said. "That was what made him formidable." Carr was watching this exchange with the careful attention of a young man filing everything away. Eleanor glanced at him. "You'll prepare a response to the 3 arguments." "Already drafted," Mercer said, and touched the document case. "I'll have Carr carry it to the recorder's office this afternoon." "Good." Eleanor stood and went to the window. The gray street traffic moved below carts, horses, 2 women walking with market baskets. A man arguing with a delivery boy about something involving a broken crate. The ordinary machinery of the city. "There's a larger question," she said without turning around. "The auction," Mercer said. She turned. "Tell me exactly what he has planned." Mercer opened the case. "Nathaniel Ashford has invited every significant landowner, merchant, and legal figure in the county to an estate auction at Ashford Hall in 11 days. He intends to sell the western timber parcel, 4,800 acres, to a Philadelphia consortium. The sale, if completed, would generate sufficient capital to establish the Ashford name independently of any contested instruments. He set a single page on the table. If he completes that sale before the court voids his claim, the buyer is a third party acting in good faith. The legal reversal becomes complicated, Eleanor said. Significantly complicated, Mercer agreed. 11 days. She had 11 days before Nathaniel turned her land into a transaction that would take years to untangle in the courts, assuming she could untangle it at all. She thought about the Philadelphia consortium men she did not know who would not know her, who would have paid good money in a public setting and would have every legal and moral justification for resisting any effort to recover the land at their expense. "Can we get an injunction?" she asked. "I have already drafted the motion," Mercer said. "But an injunction in this county for a property dispute of this scale will require a circuit judge. The nearest circuit judge is in Fredericksburg. It will take 4 days minimum to get the motion heard." 4 days, Eleanor said. "That leaves 7 days before the auction." "Yes." "Is 7 days enough?" Mercer met her eyes. "That depends on what Judge Alderman had for breakfast when our motion arrives," he said, which was the closest Jonathan Mercer ever came to humor. Eleanor almost smiled. "Get the motion to Fredericksburg today," she said. "And Mercer, I want to know every name on Nathaniel's auction guest list. Every single one." Mercer looked at her. Something shifted slightly in his expression. "May I ask why?" "Because some of those men knew my father," she said. "And some of them knew what the Whitmore name meant before Nathaniel Ashford ever heard it." She picked up her gloves from the table. "I intend to remind them." She went to see Margaret Holloway that afternoon. Margaret was 64 years old, widowed twice, and occupied a large house on the western edge of Richmond, with the absolute authority of a woman who had stopped requiring anyone's permission for anything, sometime around her 45th year. She had been Eleanor's mother's closest friend, and she had attended Eleanor's wedding with an expression that Eleanor, in the happiness of the moment, had interpreted as sentimental emotion, and had much later understood was something closer to apprehension. The drawing room was exactly as Eleanor remembered it from her childhood. Margaret herself was in the chair by the window, a book open in her lap that she closed without marking her page when Eleanor was shown in. "Sit down," Margaret said before Eleanor could speak. "Martha Slade sent word this morning. I know what happened last night." Eleanor sat. "Then I don't need to explain it." "No." Margaret looked at her steadily. "What I want to know is what you intend to do about Brent Holt." Eleanor blinked. "You know Holt?" "I know his father, and his father's father. Holt men have been making legal noise in this county for 40 years on behalf of men who needed a respectable cover for disreputable behavior." She set this book aside. "He will not limit himself to the legal arguments. He will go after your character." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that a woman who hid her identity and her assets from her husband for 3 years of marriage is a woman who can be made to look calculating, untrustworthy, the kind of woman a jury would like to believe the worst of." She said it without softening it. "You know that." "I know that," Eleanor agreed. And I intend to let him try," Eleanor said. "A man who argues in public that a woman was wrong to protect her inheritance from a husband who later forged documents to steal it." She paused. "I think the room will draw its own conclusions." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had the quality shared with Mercer and James of being comfortable with silence in a way that Eleanor had always found restful. "There's someone you should speak to," she said finally. "A woman named Patience Greer. Her husband tried something similar, not forgery, but coercion. She fought it in the Frederick County Court 6 years ago and won. She knows this kind of proceeding from the inside. Can you arrange an introduction? I can have her here by Thursday." Margaret reached out and put her hand over Eleanor's briefly firm. "Eleanor, I want to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly." Eleanor waited. "Are you all right?" The question was simple enough. It should have been easy to answer. Eleanor opened her mouth and found for one unguarded moment that the answer was more complicated than she was prepared to produce in front of another person. "I believed him once," she said finally. "Not for long, but I believed him." Margaret's hand tightened slightly. Of course you did. That was not foolishness. That was being human. He laughed, Eleanor said. At the table, when Clara he laughed. I know. I had prepared for a great many things, Eleanor said. I had prepared for anger, for legal obstruction, for the things Holt is going to say in court. I had not. She stopped. You had not prepared for it to still hurt, Margaret said. Eleanor said nothing, which was its own answer. Margaret released her hand and sat back. Good, she said. Eleanor looked at her. If it didn't hurt, Margaret said with a particular precision, you would not be the woman your mother raised. You'd be something else entirely, something that wins but doesn't know why it mattered. She picked up her book again. Come back Thursday. I'll have Patience Greer here at 2 o'clock. Takag. She was 3 blocks from Margaret's house when the carriage stopped. James's voice from the box, quiet and controlled. Ma'am, someone's following us. Eleanor did not look out immediately. How long? Since we left Carey Street this morning. Bay Horse no markings. 2 men. They've stayed back, but they've stayed with us. She thought about Holt. She thought about Nathaniel. She thought about the 11 days before the auction and the fact that a man who had already committed document forgery was not a man whose next move was easy to predict. Take the long route back to Gray Street, she said. Past the Federal Building. Yes, ma'am. The carriage moved. She sat very still and thought about what it meant that Nathaniel had begun surveillance before he had even received formal legal notice of the proceedings. It meant he had not been entirely surprised by the filing. It meant some part of him had been waiting for it, watching her the way she had been watching him, except without her patience and without her preparation. Or it meant Holt had told him to watch her and gather information before the court proceedings began. Either way, it meant she was now operating in a different kind of attention than before, and she needed to move accordingly. She reached into her pocket and touched the folded dollar bill. $1. And he had sent 2 men to follow her carriage. She almost smiled at the arithmetic of it. Thursday came with a hard, heavy rain that turned the Richmond streets to mud and brought Margaret Holloway's drawing room. A particular enclosed quality, the fire burning high and the windows fogged. Patience Greer was already. When Eleanor arrived, a compact, self-contained woman of about 50, with the face of someone who had learned to hold a lot behind a neutral expression and had held so much for so long that the neutral expression had become simply her face. She did not offer pleasantries. Eleanor liked her immediately. Mrs. Holloway tells me your husband forged the trust instruments, Patience said before Eleanor had fully settled into her chair. The signatures. My father's, post-mortem. Patience made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's ambitious, she said. Mine only tried to coerce the witnesses into lying. Forgery is a cleaner argument, actually. If you can prove it, there's no ambiguity. Did you get 3 examiners? 3, Eleanor said. Independent. Good. Holt will hire his own examiner. He will find one who will express doubt. That's not a contradiction, that's a tactic. He only needs doubt, not truth. You need to make sure the weight of evidence is so lopsided that the doubt looks like what it is, a paid opinion. Mercer has the same 3 examiners prepared to testify. In the same proceeding. At the circuit court in Fredericksburg, the motion is already there. Patience looked at her with an expression that recalibrated slightly. Not surprise exactly, but the specific adjustment of a woman who had arrived expecting one level of preparation and found something considerably more developed. You've been planning this for some time. 3 years, Eleanor said. Patience was quiet for a moment. Margaret in her chair turned a page in her book without looking up. There's something Mercer may not have told you, Patience said, about how Holt operates in open court. Tell me. He creates scenes. She said it plainly. He is a very good legal mind. His arguments are sound, but his real talent is theater. He will say something in that courtroom designed to get a reaction from you. Something about your character, or your marriage, or your motives. He will say it in front of the judge and the witnesses, and however many people are in the gallery, and he will be watching your face when he says it. Because if you react, If you show anger or distress, or even satisfaction, he will use it. He will tell the room that a woman who reacts like that is not a woman acting in good faith. He will turn your response into evidence. Eleanor thought about Nathaniel's laugh, about the precise particular effort it had taken to keep her face still and her hands quiet and her body moving toward the door without a tremor. "I have some experience," she said carefully, "in remaining composed when I would prefer not to be." Something moved across Patience Greer's face. "Yes," she said quietly. "I imagine you do." They looked at each other across the fire. Two women on opposite sides of the same kind of experience, and something passed between them that did not need to be named. "One more thing," Patience said. "The auction. If Holt can't stop the proceedings, he will try to force the sale through before the injunction is granted. He'll push Nathaniel to move the date up, maybe even to next week. He's done it before. Get the third-party sale completed, then argue good faith on the buyer's part, then tie the recovery up in appeals for 10 years. She leaned forward slightly. "You need to know if the sale date moves." "I have someone watching Ashford Hall," Eleanor said. Patience blinked. "Already?" "Since Tuesday," Eleanor said. Margaret turned another page in her book. The someone watching Ashford Hall was a man named Thomas Webb, who was 60 years old and had spent 40 of those years as her father's estate surveyor, walking every acre of Whitmore land with a measuring chain and a notebook, and the exact, unhurried attention to detail of a man who believed that accuracy was the closest a person got to virtue. He had retired 3 years ago, but had responded to Eleanor's letter within 2 days, which in Thomas Webb's correspondence habits constituted something approaching urgency. He arrived at the Gray Street house on Friday morning with mud on his boots and a notebook already open. "The date hasn't moved," he said, sitting across the kitchen table from Eleanor and James, who had been included because James had driven every road within 5 miles of Ashford Hall for 30 years and knew which ones could be watched from a comfortable distance. "The auction is still set for the 14th, but Holt was at the hall yesterday from noon to 4. They were in the study with the door closed." "How many men with Holt?" "2. Same as the ones that followed your carriage." So, they were Holt's men, not Nathaniel's personal arrangement. That told her something about who was currently directing operations at Ashford Hall, and it was not primarily Nathaniel. "The Philadelphia Consortium," she said. "Do you know who's representing them?" Thomas Webb turned 2 pages in his notebook. "A man named Gerard Foss. He came down from Philadelphia on Wednesday. He's staying at the Franklin Inn on Main Street. He brought a surveyor of his own. Young fellow, barely looks old enough to hold the chain." James made a quiet sound. Not quite a word. Eleanor looked at him. "Say it." "I know Gerard Foss," James said. "Or I knew his father. They're a shipping family primarily. The Foss family doesn't buy land for its own sake. They buy it when someone has convinced them it's worth more than the asking price." Meaning Nathaniel has told him something about that western parcel that makes it more attractive than 4,800 acres of timber ought to be. James turned his hat in his hands once. "There's a river access point on the western edge of that parcel, ma'am. Your father never developed it. He felt the river route was not yet commercially significant enough to warrant it. But if someone were to suggest that a new commercial route was being planned..." Eleanor set down her cup. "Is a new commercial route being planned?" "There's been talk," James said carefully. "I heard it from a man at the livery last spring. Nothing confirmed, but talk." She sat with that for a moment. Nathaniel had not simply forged documents to steal land. He had forged documents to steal land. He had specific advance knowledge was about to become substantially more valuable. He had positioned himself carefully at the intersection of a legal fraud and a commercial opportunity, and he had believed himself safe because he had believed Eleanor was exactly what she appeared to be. The depth of his miscalculation was in its way impressive. "Thomas," she said, "I need you to find out everything that exists in public record about that river access point. Survey records, survey requests, any applications to the state legislature for commercial development rights." "I can have it by Monday," Thomas said. "I need it by Sunday." He looked at her. "Saturday," he said, which was Thomas Webb's version of an agreement. Saturday came and went, And Thomas Webb delivered what he had found, and what he had found was more than Eleanor had expected, and exactly as consequential as James had implied. She sat with it for 2 hours on Sunday morning, cross-referencing against the trust ledger, and then she sent for Mercer. He arrived within the hour, which told her his own sources had been working the same ground, and he had been waiting for her to reach the same point. "You know about the river route," she said when he was seated. "I suspected," he said. "I confirmed it yesterday. There is an application before the Virginia legislature filed in March, the same month as the management transfer for commercial development rights on the Western River access. The application was filed under the Ashford name. March. Nathaniel had filed the forged management transfer and the commercial development application in the same month. He had moved on both simultaneously, which meant he had planned both. Simultaneously, which meant this had not been opportunism. This had been a scheme with a timeline and a sequence and a level of deliberate construction that went well beyond a man who had simply decided he no longer wanted his wife. He had decided he wanted her land. The rest had followed from that. Eleanor thought about their first year of marriage. She thought about his questions, what she remembered as ordinary questions. At the time, the questions a husband asked about her father's estate, about the family holdings, about the trust. She had been vague because she was always vague about the specifics, because that was how her father had taught her to handle those questions with people she did not yet fully trust. She had thought Nathaniel was simply being curious. He had been conducting a survey. "How much is the river access worth?" she asked. Mercer named a figure. She was quiet for a moment. "That's 3 times what he's asking for the parcel." "Yes," Mercer said. "Which means the Philadelphia Consortium, once they complete the survey your father never commissioned, will discover they've acquired something worth considerably more than they paid. At which point they become very interested in protecting their ownership." He set his hands flat on the document case. "Nathaniel has found buyers who have a financial incentive to defend the sale regardless of how it was obtained." Eleanor stood and went to the window. This was the part she had not fully seen. She had seen the forgery. She had seen the auction. She had not seen the river route, and she had not seen the Philadelphia Consortium's stake, and she had not seen that Nathaniel, whatever his moral failures, was not a stupid man and had not been operating stupidly. "The injunction," she said. "We need it before the auction, not by a day, before." "I have sent a second letter to Judge Alderman," Mercer said. "I have also—" He paused with the precision of a man choosing words that could not be improved. "I have enclosed a summary of the commercial development application alongside the forgery evidence, so that the judge understands that what is before him is not a domestic property dispute. It is a fraud on the commercial development process of the state of Virginia." Eleanor turned. "That changes the category." "It changes the category entirely," Mercer said. "It is no longer a matter of family law. It is a matter of public interest. Judge Alderman is a man who has spent 30 years protecting the integrity of Virginia property records. This case is now in its larger dimensions an attack on those records." He looked at her. "He will not take that lightly." She stood there and thought about Nathaniel in his study 3 years ago, asking careful questions about her father's estate with his careful, rehearsed voice, and she thought about the dollar bill Clara had dropped on her plate, and she thought about 43 people laughing in a room full of candles that were hers. She thought about the river access on the western edge of the parcel that her father had looked at and decided with his particular patient wisdom was not yet worth developing. "Not yet," her father had said. He had been right about the timing, as he was right about most things. He had simply not anticipated the particular form that eventually would take. "How long until Alderman responds?" she asked. "I expect we will hear by Tuesday," Mercer said. "And if the answer is no—" Mercer met her eyes. He held them for a long moment. "Then we attend the auction," he said, "and we make certain that every man in that room understands exactly what he is bidding on." Eleanor thought about the auction room. She thought about the men her father had known, the ones whose names appeared on the older deeds, the ones who understood what the Whitmore Trust actually was. She thought about Gerard Foss from Philadelphia, who would be in that room with his young surveyor and his purchased expectations, and she thought about Nathaniel standing at the head of it all, Confident, prepared, certain, he had arranged the future to his specifications. She thought about 11 days reduced now to 6. She reached into her pocket and touched the dollar bill. "Then we attend the auction," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were still. The same composure she had worn at the dinner table 6 days ago, when 43 people laughed, and she stood up and smoothed her dress and walked out without looking back. She had not looked back then. She was not going to look back now. There was too much ahead. Judge Alderman's response arrived on Monday. Not Tuesday. Monday, which meant he had read Mercer's second letter the same day it arrived, set aside whatever else was on his desk, and responded before his evening meal. Mercer sent Daniel Carr to Grace Street with the sealed envelope at 4:30, and Carr arrived slightly out of breath in the way of a young man who understood that some documents did not benefit from being carried at a leisurely pace. Eleanor broke the seal at the sitting room table with Martha Slade standing in the doorway pretending to be interested in the hall clock. She read it once, then she set it down and read it again. "Well," Martha said, abandoning the pretense entirely. "He granted the injunction," Eleanor said. Martha made a sound that was not quite dignified for a woman of her composure and long service. "When, effective immediately, the auction cannot proceed until the forgery instruments are resolved in open court." Eleanor set the letter flat on the table. "He also—" She stopped. "What? He's coming himself. Judge Alderman is riding down from Fredericksburg to oversee the proceeding." She looked up. Mercer told him about the commercial development application, the river route. Martha went very still. "He's treating it as a public matter. He's treating it as fraud against the Commonwealth of Virginia," Eleanor said, "which is what it is." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the Grace Street traffic moved through the late afternoon heat horses. Voices the ordinary, unmoved world, going about its business, while the thing she had spent 3 years building arrived at the edge of its first public test. She thought about Nathaniel receiving word that the auction was enjoined. She thought about his face, the specific rearrangement of a confident man, encountering an obstacle he had not built into his calculations. She thought about Holt. Who would be the one to deliver the news? Who would have to explain to his client that the circuit judge was not going to be managed from a distance? She almost felt something for Nathaniel in that moment. Not sympathy, she had used up her sympathy over a long 3 years of careful watching. But a kind of recognition. She knew what it was to discover that the ground you were standing on was different from what you'd believed. The difference was, she had discovered it slowly over time, and had used the discovery to build something. Nathaniel was going to discover it all at once in public, with 40 of the county's most significant men watching. She picked up the injunction letter and carried it to the writing table. She had 3 more letters to write before morning. Word of the injunction reached Ashford Hall by Tuesday noon, which was faster than Eleanor had expected and suggested Holt had sources at the recorder's office she would need to account for going forward. Thomas Webb brought the report himself, arriving at Grace Street with his notebook and his muddy boots, and the contained expression of a man carrying significant intelligence. "Holt was there within an hour of receiving the news," Thomas said. "He and Nathaniel were in the study for 2 hours. I couldn't hear the substance, but I could hear the volume. They argued. Nathaniel argued," Thomas said precisely. "Holt, from what I could determine, spoke at a consistent level throughout. It was Nathaniel's voice that rose." Eleanor understood the distinction. Holt was managing a client who had just discovered his plan had a serious structural problem. Nathaniel was discovering for the first time in this matter that he was not in control of the timeline. "What did Clara do?" she asked. Thomas glanced at her. "She left the hall at 2:00, took her personal carriage, came back at 5 with a different expression than she left with." "Where did she go?" "Her father's house in Charlottesville," Thomas said. "I had James follow at a distance." Eleanor looked at James, who was standing at the kitchen doorway. "Her father's a merchant," Eleanor said. "Why would she go to her father after the injunction?" James turned his hat once. "Clara Beaumont's father has a letter of credit outstanding with the Franklin Bank in Richmond," he said. "One that Nathaniel co-signed in January." The room was very quiet. Eleanor sat with that. January. Before the management transfer. Before the auction was announced, Nathaniel had co-signed a financial instrument for Clara Beaumont's father in January, which meant Clara's family was not simply a romantic complication. Clara's family was financially entangled with Nathaniel's operations, which meant Clara herself was not simply a woman who wanted to be Mrs. Ashford. She had a stake. "Get me everything on that letter of credit," Eleanor said to Mercer, who had arrived in the middle of Thomas's report and was standing near the window with his case under his arm and his listening expression fully engaged. "By tomorrow morning." "It will be difficult," Mercer said. "Bank records are—" "I'm not asking for the bank records," Eleanor said. "I'm asking you to find out what is publicly known about the Beaumont family's financial position. Their property records. Any instruments filed under their name. If that letter of credit is co-signed, there will be a trace." Mercer nodded once. "Tomorrow morning," he said. The letter of credit was the first thing. The second thing arrived that same evening in the form of a visit Eleanor had not arranged and had not anticipated. She was at the writing table when Martha showed Clara Beaumont into the sitting room. Eleanor did not stand. She set down her pen, turned in her chair, and looked at the woman who had placed a dollar bill on her dinner plate 6 days ago, and she waited. Clara was not wearing pale green silk. She was wearing a traveling dress, practical and dark, and her hair was not arranged with the social precision of the dinner. She looked in an honest assessment like a woman who had spent the afternoon making a decision she was not entirely comfortable with. She stood in the center of the room and did not sit down. "I came alone," Clara said. "Nathaniel doesn't know I'm here." "I assumed as much," Eleanor said. "I need to know?" Clara stopped, looked at the floor, looked back up. "I need to know if what Holt told Nathaniel this afternoon is true." "What did Holt tell him?" "That you have evidence of more than the forgery." Clara's voice was steady, but something under it was not. "That you have evidence of what the river access is worth, and that the judge knows." "That is true," Eleanor said. Clara absorbed that. Something moved across her face that was not what Eleanor had expected. It was not anger, and it was not defiance. It was something closer to calculation completing itself. The expression of a woman running numbers she did not like the total of. "My father's letter of credit," Clara said. Eleanor said nothing. "If Nathaniel's instruments are voided," Clara said, "if the commercial development application collapses with them, my father's letter of credit is secured against projected income from the river access rights." She looked at Eleanor directly. "If those rights revert to you, my father loses the security and the bank calls the letter. He loses everything he has borrowed against it." "How much?" Clara named a figure. Eleanor kept her face exactly where it was. It was a significant sum. Not ruinous for a family of means, but the Beaumonts were not a family of deep means. They were a family of appearance, of positioned credit, of the kind of respectable surface that required constant, careful maintenance. That figure called in without warning would pull the surface apart. "You didn't know," Eleanor said. It was not a question, but she said it as one. Clara's jaw tightened. "I knew Nathaniel had involved my father. I didn't know the specific instruments. I didn't know he had borrowed against the development rights before the rights were secured." A pause. "I didn't know the rights weren't his to secure." Silence settled between them. Eleanor thought about the woman standing in front of her, 23 years old, willing to humiliate another woman in public, for an audience, willing to take a man from his wife if the man was willing to be taken. Not in any accounting and innocent, but also not as it was becoming clear the primary architect of what had been done. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked. "I want to know if there is any version of this." Clara stopped again. This was not a woman accustomed to not knowing what she wanted to say. "Any version where my father is not destroyed by a mistake Nathaniel made and I didn't know about." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down, Miss Beaumont," she said. Clara sat. "I am going to tell you something," Eleanor said, "and I need you to understand that I am not telling you out of generosity. I am telling you because it is accurate, and because what you do with accurate information is your own business." She folded her hands on the table. Your father's letter of credit, if the development application collapses, becomes a matter between your father and the Franklin Bank. The Whitmore Trust is not a party to that instrument, and I have no legal mechanism to call it. If the bank calls it, that is between them. Clara stared. So my father is in a difficult position created by Nathaniel Ashford, who used your family's financial vulnerability as collateral without fully informing you of the risks. Eleanor kept her voice level. That is a separate matter from mine. I am pursuing what is mine. What happens to instruments Nathaniel created without my knowledge or consent is not my responsibility to untangle. Clara was quiet, processing. However, Eleanor said. Clara looked up. If your father has any documentation of the arrangement with Nathaniel, any correspondence, any signed agreement, any instrument that shows Nathaniel represented the development rights as secured, when he had reason to know they were contested, that documentation has legal value. Not to me, to your father, as evidence that he was induced to sign under misrepresentation. She paused. A man with that documentation has options. Clara sat very still. You're telling me my father can sue Nathaniel? I'm telling you that a lawyer who is not Brent Holt might find that documentation worth reviewing, Eleanor said. Something shifted entirely in Clara Beaumont's face. The calculation completed and resolved into something different. Not gratitude. Eleanor was not interested in Clara Beaumont's gratitude, but a clear-eyed reassessment of the landscape. The expression of a woman who had come into a room expecting one thing and was leaving with something considerably more actionable. Clara stood. She smoothed her dress. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite what Eleanor had seen across the dinner table 6 days ago. The dollar, Clara said. On your plate. Yes. I would not have done it, Clara said, if I had known. Eleanor looked at her steadily. I know, she said. That is why I am talking to you now. Clara left without further words. Martha showed her out. Eleanor turned back to the writing table and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, feeling the particular complicated texture of a situation where the right thing and the practical thing arrived at the same place through different roads. She picked up her pen and went back to her letters. The proceeding was set for Friday, 4 days after the injunction, 10 days after the dinner, and Judge Alderman arrived in Richmond on Thursday evening, which Eleanor knew because Mercer had a clerk at the judge customarily stayed, and the clerk had sent word by 9 o'clock. She did not sleep well on Thursday night. She did not expect to. She lay in the upstairs room of the Grace Street house and listened to the city going quiet around her, and thought about every piece of the evidence in Mercer's document case, and whether it was sufficient, and whether she had missed anything, and whether Holt had found something she had not accounted for. She thought about Patience Greer's warning. He will say something designed to get a reaction from you. She had been turning that over for a week, trying to anticipate the specific shape of it. Holt knew the facts of the case. He knew the forgery argument was sound. His ground was not the facts, his ground was her character, her concealment, her patience. He would try to make her patience look like scheming. He would try to make 3 years of quiet documentation look like the behavior of a woman who had married Nathaniel with the specific intention of trapping him. He would argue that a woman who hid her identity was a woman who had manufactured the whole situation to her own advantage. He was not entirely wrong about the facts. He was entirely wrong about the meaning. She lay there in the dark and thought about how to make that distinction clear in a room full of men, some of whom would want to believe Holt, and some of whom would not, and none of whom would be helped by Eleanor losing her composure. She got up at 5 and wrote for 2 hours. Not letters, not legal preparations. She wrote out in her own hand the sequence of events as she understood them, starting from the first dinner party where Nathaniel had asked about her father's estate moving through the marriage, and the quiet watching, and the first discovered forgery, and the 3 years of documentation. She wrote it not for Mercer and not for the judge. She wrote it for herself. So that when she walked into that room on Friday morning, she knew the shape of her own story, with the precision of someone who had read it enough times to carry it without notes. She finished before Martha was awake. She folded the pages and put them in the writing table drawer and went downstairs to make tea. Friday morning. The Henrico County Courthouse sat 2 blocks from the river and smelled on summer mornings of warm wood and old paper, and the particular institutional gravity of a building that had been settling arguments for 40 years. Eleanor arrived at 8:30 with Mercer on her left and Daniel Carr on her right, and Thomas Webb and James waiting outside, which was where they would stay, because Mercer had been explicit: the fewer people inside, the less material for Holt to work with. The gallery was not empty. She had not expected it to be empty. Word of the proceeding had moved through the county in the way that significant things always moved quietly and with great speed, but she had not expected quite this many people. 2 rows of benches full, a third row filling as they entered. She recognized faces. Men her father had done business with. Men whose families had neighboring land. 2 women she didn't recognize who sat together at the end of the second row and watched everything with the focused attention of people who had a stake she hadn't yet identified. She did not look for Nathaniel when she entered. She took her seat and arranged her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the room. How was there? She felt it before she saw it, that particular awareness, 3 years deep, of where he was in any given space. He was at the opposite table with Holt on his right and a second associate on his left, and he was wearing his best coat and his expression of controlled authority, the one he wore when he had decided how something was going to go and was waiting for the room to catch up. She did not look at him directly. She would look at him when it was necessary and not before. Holt was 52 years old, built like a man who had spent his life in courtrooms and knew how to fill them with white hair and a face that had long settled into an expression of permanent patient skepticism. He glanced at Eleanor when she sat down, and the glance lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate and not long enough to be rude. A measurement. She returned it without expression. Judge Alderman entered at 9 o'clock exactly. How was 68, spare and deliberate with the economy of movement of a man who had stopped making unnecessary gestures sometime in his 40s. He sat. He looked at both tables. He opened his record. This proceeding concerns the contested instruments filed against the Whitmore Land Trust by Nathaniel Ashford in March of this year, he said without preamble. The specific matters before this court are the validity of the management transfer documents, the standing of the original trust instruments, and the status of the commercial development application filed concurrently with the management transfer. He looked up. We will begin with the document examination, Mr. Mercer. Mercer rose. What followed was an hour of methodical, precise legal argument that Eleanor followed with complete attention, and the rest of the gallery followed with varying degrees. Mercer presented the 3 examiners' findings in sequence. Each one testified to the same conclusion through different technical analysis. The signatures on the management transfer documents were not produced by the hand of Edmund Whitmore and were not produced before 1812. The instruments were fabrications. Holt cross-examined each examiner. His questions were precise and technically informed and designed to introduce uncertainty at the margins. The difficulty of absolute dating. The possibility of deterioration. The limits of the available analysis methods. He was good. Eleanor watched him work and understood why he had survived 40 years of courtrooms. He did not overreach. He did not argue that the examiners were lying. He simply suggested repeatedly, and with great professional courtesy, that certainty was a more complicated thing than it appeared. After the 3rd examiner, Holt rose for his primary argument. He spoke for 20 minutes. His voice was even, his pace controlled, his language precise. He laid out the 3 arguments Carr had reported: the superseding management transfer, the misrepresentation claim, the guardianship provision. He was careful and thorough, and gave nothing away in his expression that might tell Eleanor where he was building to. Then he turned to face the gallery rather than the judge. That was the moment. Eleanor recognized it, the shift of orientation, the turn toward the audience instead of the bench. This was theater now. The question before this court, Holt said in a voice that carried to the back row without effort, is not simply whether documents were forged. It is whether a woman who concealed her identity, her assets, and the full nature of her family's holdings from a man she induced to marry her, whether that woman can now claim the protection of instruments she deliberately obscured. He paused. Mrs. Ashford, or if she prefers Madame Whitmore, is asking this court to reward 3 years of calculated concealment with the full recovery of a disputed estate. He turned to look at Eleanor. The gallery was very quiet. I would ask the court to consider, Holt said. What kind of woman enters a marriage with a fully formed legal strategy already in place? What kind of woman watches for 3 years as her husband makes decisions based on information she has deliberately withheld, and documents those decisions carefully, methodically, waiting for the appropriate moment to produce them? He kept his eyes on her. That is not the behavior of a wronged wife, Your Honor. That is the behavior of a woman who decided before she spoke her vows how this would end. The gallery stirred. Eleanor's hands were in her lap, perfectly still. She looked back at with the same expression she had worn at the dinner table 10 days ago, when 43 people laughed and she did not flinch, and she thought, there it is. That is the thing he has been building to. And then she thought something else. She thought, he is not wrong that I was prepared. He is wrong about what the preparation means. She did not react. Judge Alderman looked at her for one moment, a brief assessing look, and then looked back at Holt. That is an argument about character, Mr. Holt, he said. It is not an argument about documents. With respect, Your Honor, character informs motive and motive. The document examination is not concluded, Alderman said. We will address character arguments after the evidentiary record is established. Continue. Holt inclined his head and sat. Mercer rose again. He presented the commercial development application filed in March under the Ashford name for river access rights on land. The Whitmore Trust had held continuously since 1789, and he laid it alongside the management transfer, and he asked the court to look at the dates and the sequence and the relationship between the two filings, and to consider whether a man who filed a development application on land simultaneously with a management transfer that had not yet been legally established was a man who had acted in good faith, or a man who had arranged two frauds to support each other. Judge Alderman looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. Nathaniel had been still throughout. Eleanor had tracked him in her peripheral vision, the set of his shoulders, the position of his hands on the table, the small adjustments that happened when a man was working very hard to appear unaffected. When Mercer laid the development application and the management transfer side by side, something happened in Nathaniel's posture that was not quite visible, but was entirely perceptible to a woman who had spent 3 years learning the vocabulary of his body. He had not expected Mercer to have the development application. He had not expected it to be presented in this room in this sequence next to the management transfer. He had not fully thought through the fact that public filings were public. Holt leaned close to Nathaniel and said something very quietly. Nathaniel's jaw moved once. Eleanor watched it happen and felt not satisfaction. That was too simple a word, but the precise clarifying sensation of a thing that had been obscured becoming visible. The full shape of what had been done to her, laid out in public in daylight where it could be seen. Then the door at the back of the gallery opened. Eleanor did not turn around immediately. She heard the sound of several people entering, heard the gallery adjust with the particular rustle of a room reconfiguring its attention. Then she heard Holt's voice. Not his courtroom voice, his actual voice. Lower and involuntary. What in? She turned. Clara Beaumont stood at the back of the gallery. Beside her stood an older man. Eleanor had never met, compact, serious, with the bearing of someone who had arrived, prepared for a formal proceeding, and the expression of someone who had arrived very specifically prepared. Behind them was a young attorney Eleanor also did not recognize carrying a document case. Clara met Eleanor's eyes across the room. She gave the smallest possible nod. Eleanor turned back to the front. Mercer, who had seen the entrance from a better angle, leaned close to Eleanor's ear. The man beside Miss Beaumont, he said very quietly, is a Mr. Aldous Beaumont, her father. A pause. He appears to have brought his own counsel. Eleanor said nothing. Holt was on his feet. Your Honor, I would ask that any new parties seeking to enter this proceeding. This is a public proceeding, Mr. Holt, Alderman said without looking up from the documents. The gallery is open. Sit down. Holt sat. He turned once and looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had made a decision she was no longer second-guessing. Holt turned back to the front and for the first time that morning, something in his composed professional face showed the specific quality of a man who had just discovered that the number of variables in the room had changed without his knowledge. Eleanor felt the folded dollar bill in her pocket. She had not planned to bring it. She had taken it from the writing table drawer that morning without thinking, and she had put it in her pocket, and she had not questioned the instinct. She left it where it was. Judge Alderman set the two documents down on his bench and looked at both tables. "I have some questions," he said, "for both parties." The room went very quiet. "Mr. Mercer, the trust instruments name Eleanor Whitmore as sole heir with full legal authority. They predate the management transfer by 26 years. They carry the original charter seal. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Your Honor." "Mr. Holt, the management transfer documents carry signatures dated to a period after the signatory was deceased. Your examiner's testimony this morning introduced uncertainty, but not contradiction. Is there a version of your argument that does not require this court to disregard the findings of 3 independent examiners?" A pause. "Your Honor, the examiner's findings are not conclusive." "That is not what I asked." Alderman looked at him steadily. "Is there a version of your argument that does not require this court to disregard the findings of 3 independent examiners?" The courtroom held its breath. Holt was a man who had spent 40 years in rooms like this one, and Eleanor watched him make the calculation that only a very experienced attorney makes correctly, the calculation of when the argument is over, and the question is only how much you lose. She watched him make it and arrive at the right answer. "The question of the examiner's findings is a matter for the court's judgment," Holt said carefully. "Indeed it is," Alderman said. He made a note. "Mr. Mercer, you will provide this court with the complete trust instruments for formal review. Mr. Holt, you will provide any countervailing documentation by Monday noon. We will reconvene on Wednesday." He looked up at the gallery. "This proceeding is recessed." He stood. The room stood. The sound of movement and breath and low urgent conversation began. Nathaniel pushed back his chair and looked for the first time all morning directly at Eleanor. She met his eyes. She had thought on Thursday night about what this moment would feel like. She had not predicted precisely. What she felt was not triumph, not yet, and it was not the vindication she had been building toward for 3 years. What she felt was the particular clarifying recognition of a man seeing her clearly for what she suspected was the first time. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she thought about the rehearsed proposal notes she had found in his riding coat, and about the careful questions at the early dinner parties, and about his hand on the small of her back, the night they were married, which had felt genuine, and which she had spent 3 years trying to determine whether it had been. She still did not know the answer to that. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Mercer was at her elbow. "Wednesday," he said. "Alderman will rule on Wednesday." "He's already decided," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes," Mercer said. "He has." She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress, the same small gesture she had made at the dinner table 10 days ago, and she walked toward the gallery doors, and behind her she heard the courtroom beginning to move, and around her she heard the gallery voices, and somewhere to her left she heard Clara Beaumont's voice saying something to her father in a low, urgent tone, and she heard James at the door tipping his hat and saying "ma'am" as she came through. She stepped outside. The summer air was heavy and immediate. The street was busy. A cart moved past, a dog barked twice at something across the road. 2 men argued amiably about the price of something at the corner. The ordinary, unimpressed world going about its business. She walked to the carriage, and James held the door, and she sat down, and she put her hand in her pocket, and held the dollar bill, and let out one long, quiet breath, the first unguarded breath she had allowed herself in 10 days. Wednesday. 4 more days. She had come this far on patience and preparation, and the particular hard-won discipline of a woman who knew the difference between the moment to wait and the moment to move. Wednesday was the moment to move. She was ready. The 4 days between Friday's recess and Wednesday's ruling were the longest Eleanor had spent since the first winter of her marriage, when she had understood what she had married into and had sat alone in the Ashford Hall library for 3 days working out what she intended to do about it. She did not waste them. Saturday morning, she met with Mercer for 2 hours, reviewing every document they would present on Wednesday. Saturday afternoon, she met with Patience Greer, who had attended the Friday proceeding from the second row and had specific practical observations about Holt's strategy and where his remaining arguments were weakest. Saturday evening, she sat alone at the Grace Street writing table and went through the trust ledger one more time, because she had learned from her father that you never walked into a room carrying numbers you hadn't personally verified that morning. Sunday she rested. Not because she wanted to, because Patience Greer had told her with the directness of a woman who had learned this the hard way, that walking into a ruling looking like you hadn't slept was the fastest way to give the other side a visible advantage. Eleanor lay in the upstairs room and stared at the ceiling and rested with the deliberate, disciplined effort of a woman resting against her nature. Monday brought something she had not anticipated. Mercer arrived at Grace Street at 8 in the morning with Daniel Carr, and an expression that was not his controlled urgency expression. It was something quieter and more serious than that. "Holt filed last night," Mercer said before he was fully through the door. His response to Alderman. "What did he file?" Mercer sat. He placed the document case on the table and opened it and took out a single page. "He withdrew the guardianship argument," he said. "And the misrepresentation argument." Eleanor went still. Both of them. Both of them. His Monday filing argues only one point. Mercer set the page in front of her. He argues that the management transfer, regardless of the question of the signatures, represents the expressed intention of both parties to the marriage that Eleanor Whitmore, by living in Ashford Hall for 3 years without contesting the management arrangement, implicitly ratified the transfer. Eleanor read the page. She read it again. "Implicit ratification," she said. "It is not a strong argument," Mercer said. "But it is not an entirely foolish one. He is saying that your silence constituted consent." She set the page down. She thought about 3 years of silence, about letters routed through Richmond so carefully that not one of them had ever arrived at Grace Street under her own name, about conversations with Mercer conducted after dark, about the specific, exhausting discipline of a woman who had decided that premature action was worse than no action, and had held that position for 3 years under considerable pressure. He was trying to turn her strategy against her. "Can he make that argument work?" she asked. "In another court with another judge, possibly." Mercer looked at her steadily. "In front of Alderman, who has already read the development application and the forgery evidence, and who has already seen that the management transfer was built on fabricated signatures, no. Ratification requires valid underlying instruments. You cannot ratify a fraud." "Then why file it?" "Because," Mercer said, "it is the only argument that does not require him to defend the forgery directly. He is retreating to ground he can actually hold. He knows the forgery case is lost. He is trying to find a position that survives the ruling. Something he can appeal on, something that keeps the case in motion long enough to complicate the recovery." Eleanor understood it completely. Holt was not trying to win on Wednesday. He was trying to survive Wednesday with enough legal ground left to fight on afterward. She thought about the river access. About Gerard Foss in Philadelphia, who had come down expecting to buy 4,800 acres of timberland, and had left with an injunction notice and an uncertain investment. She thought about what Foss would do if the ruling went her way, and the Ashford instruments were voided, and the development application collapsed. Whether he would come after Nathaniel for misrepresentation, whether he would simply walk away, whether he would try to negotiate directly with Eleanor for access rights under different terms. She had been thinking about that last possibility for several days. She had not shared it with Mercer yet. "There is one more thing," Mercer said. She looked at him. He reached into the case and produced a second page. "This arrived from Aldous Beaumont's counsel this morning. He is filing a separate action against Nathaniel Ashford for misrepresentation in the letter of credit arrangement. He is alleging that Nathaniel represented the development rights as secured and uncontested when he had reason to know they were built on forged instruments." Eleanor looked at the page. "Clara's father is suing Nathaniel. He filed yesterday," Mercer said. "Beaumont's counsel has requested that his action be heard in the same proceeding as ours, given the overlapping evidentiary basis. Did Alderman grant it? He has not yet responded. But the request was reasonable, and the evidentiary basis is genuine. I expect he will. Eleanor sat back. She thought about Clara Beaumont standing in her sitting room 6 days ago, working through the arithmetic of her family's exposure, with the focused attention of a woman who had been given accurate information and was deciding what to do with it. She thought about what she had said. I'm telling you that a lawyer who is not Brent Holt might find that documentation worth reviewing. Clara had found a lawyer who was not Brent Holt, and that lawyer had moved faster than Eleanor had expected by several days. She thought about Nathaniel on Monday morning, receiving 2 pieces of news: Holt's narrow surviving argument and Beaumont's action against him. She thought about the specific quality of a man discovering that the woman he had undermined and the family he had used were now simultaneously coming at him from 2 directions. She allowed herself briefly, and without guilt, the quiet satisfaction of accurate prediction. Tell Beaumont's counsel, she said, that we have no objection to the consolidated proceeding. Tuesday arrived with the particular suspended quality of the day before something that cannot be undone. Eleanor went through her morning with the careful attention she gave to all-important morning's tea before anything else. The trust open on the table, the pages she had written Thursday night taken from the drawer and read once more and then folded back. She had the shape of her own story in her hands. She did not need the pages anymore. James came at 10 with Thomas Webb, and Thomas laid his notebook on the kitchen table with the expression of a man who had found something and was measuring how significant it was before he named it. Nathaniel left Ashford Hall this morning, Thomas said. Early, before 7. Eleanor looked up. Where did he go? To see you, Thomas said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Martha at the stove did not turn around, but her posture shifted in a way that indicated she was listening very carefully. He came here, Eleanor said. He was turned away at the door. Mrs. Slade told him you were not receiving. Thomas paused. He asked if he could leave a message. Mrs. Slade told him he could write a letter. Eleanor looked at Martha's back. Martha turned from the stove with the expression of a woman who had been turning people away from doors for 40 years and felt no particular need to explain her decisions. He did not, Martha said, appear to have brought paper. Eleanor almost smiled. Did he say anything? He said, Martha set a cup on the table with deliberate care. He said he needed 5 minutes. I told him 5 minutes was not available. She met Eleanor's eyes. I told him that if he had something to say, the courthouse would be open tomorrow morning. Thank you, Martha, Eleanor said. She looked at the folded pages on the table and thought about what Nathaniel had wanted 5 minutes to say. She had a reasonable sense of the shape of it. He had come with something, an offer, an appeal, a version of the argument that did not require him to stand in a courtroom and have everything laid out in public in front of men he would have to face for the rest of his professional life. He had come to try to resolve this without Wednesday. He had come too late, by approximately 3 years. James, she said. Ma'am. Have the carriage ready for 8 tomorrow morning. She picked up her cup. We will arrive before Holt. They arrived before Holt. They arrived before Alderman, before Nathaniel, before the gallery had more than a handful of people in it. Mercer was already there, arranged at the plaintiff's table with Carr and the document case, and the particular focused stillness of a man who had prepared everything that could be prepared and was now simply waiting for the room to fill. The gallery filled quickly, more people than Friday. Eleanor noticed that without surprise. Word of the Beaumont action had moved through the county over the weekend, and the consolidated proceeding had attracted the attention of men who had not been at Friday's hearing: merchants, landowners. 2 men she recognized as having dealings with the Franklin Bank. 3 she recognized as friends of her father's, who had not been at the original dinner, but whose names appeared on the older Whitmore land records in ways that made their presence today entirely explicable. Nathaniel arrived at 8:45. He was alone. Holt came through a separate door 2 minutes later with his 2 associates, and something in the way he arranged himself at the table, slightly more contained than Friday, slightly more deliberate, confirmed for Eleanor that he had spent the weekend adjusting his expectations for this morning. Aldous Beaumont arrived with Clara and their counsel at 8:50. They took seats in the gallery rather than at a table, which meant Beaumont's action would be addressed after the primary ruling. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not look at Nathaniel. Nathaniel did not look at her. Eleanor noted both of those things. Judge Alderman entered at 9 precisely. He sat. He arranged his papers. He looked at both tables, and then at the gallery, and then back at his papers, in the way of a man who had formed his conclusion before he entered the room, and was now moving through the formal sequence that the law required before it could be stated aloud. This court has reviewed the complete evidentiary record in the matter of Whitmore Trust versus the Ashford Management Instruments, he said. We have considered the findings of the document examiners, the original trust charter and succession provisions, the management transfer filing, and the concurrent commercial development application. We have also reviewed the supplementary argument submitted by the respondent on Monday. He looked at Holt. The court has considered the implicit ratification argument carefully. Holt straightened slightly. The implicit ratification argument fails, Alderman said with no change in his pace, on the fundamental ground that ratification requires a valid underlying act. A forged instrument cannot be ratified because it was never a valid instrument in the first instance. A party's silence in the face of fraud is not consent to the fraud. It is in many circumstances the only rational response available to a party gathering evidence of that fraud. He looked at his papers. The management transfer documents filed in March of this year are hereby voided in their entirety. The original Whitmore Trust instruments are recognized as the governing authority over all Whitmore land holdings. Eleanor Whitmore is confirmed as sole heir and legal authority of the Whitmore Land Trust. The gallery moved. Not loudly, not the dramatic eruption of a theater crowd, but the particular collective exhale of a room full of people releasing tension they had not fully known they were holding. Eleanor's hands were in her lap. Still. Furthermore, Alderman continued, and the room quieted again. The commercial development application filed under the Ashford name for river access rights on Whitmore land is hereby voided as it was filed without legal authority over the land in question. This court is referring the matter of document forgery to the Commonwealth Prosecutor's Office for review. That review will determine whether criminal proceedings are appropriate. He looked up. This court makes no determination on that question. That is not our matter today. Our matter today is the property instruments, and on those instruments this court has ruled. He looked at Nathaniel for the first time. Nathaniel sat very still. He had the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had still somewhere below the knowledge been hoping it would not. Eleanor recognized it. It was the expression she had seen on his face in the early months when something he had arranged did not arrange itself as planned. That specific collision between expectation and reality that he had never in all the time she had known him learned to absorb gracefully. Mr. Ashford, Alderman said, do you have anything to say for the record before this court proceeds to the Beaumont matter? The room waited. Holt leaned close to Nathaniel, said something very quietly. Nathaniel's jaw moved once. He looked at the table. Then he looked up, and he looked not at the judge, but at Eleanor directly, for the first time since Friday. She looked back at him. He said, addressing the room at large but looking at her, I have nothing to say for the record. Alderman nodded. Then this portion of the proceeding is concluded. We will address the Beaumont matter in 15 minutes. This court is in brief recess. He rose. The room rose with him. The 15-minute recess had the quality of a held breath released all at once. People stood moved, spoke in low, urgent voices. Mercer was immediately at Eleanor's side with Carr and the document case, and the composed expression of a man who had just done what he came to do. The referral to the prosecutor, Eleanor said quietly. Yes, Mercer said. That was Alderman's own decision. I did not request it. He made it on the basis of the forgery evidence. A pause. It does not obligate the prosecutor to act, but it creates a formal record that cannot be ignored. Eleanor absorbed that. She had not built toward criminal proceedings that had never been her objective. What she had wanted was her land back and the legal clarity of its return and the public acknowledgement that what had been done to her had been done. The prosecutor's referral was beyond what she had planned for, and it created consequences she had not asked for, and she sat with the complicated feeling of a woman who had set a thing in motion that had moved further than she had aimed. She thought about what she had said to Margaret Holloway weeks ago. "I am not interested in destroying anyone. I am interested in recovering what is mine." That was still true. She needed it to remain true even now. "Mercer," she said, "is there anything I can do about the referral?" He looked at her carefully. "You could write a letter to the prosecutor's office noting that your primary objective has been satisfied by the civil ruling, and that you do not intend to pursue a separate criminal complaint." He paused. "It would not stop the referral proceeding, but it would be on the record." "Draft it this afternoon," she said. "I'll sign it." Mercer looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had known her family for 40 years and was at this particular moment thinking about her father. He said nothing. He simply nodded and made a note. She was standing looking toward the gallery when she felt someone at her elbow. Not Mercer. A different presence slightly uncertain of its own proximity. She turned. Nathaniel was standing 2 feet away. Holt was not with him. His associates were not with him. He had crossed the room alone while the recess held, and he was standing in front of his wife in the middle of the Henrico County Courthouse with the expression she had least expected from him. Not anger, not calculation, not the rehearsed authority he had worn at every difficult moment she could recall. He simply looked tired. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. He stopped. Started again. "I came to Grace Street yesterday. I know. I needed to..." Another stop. She watched him navigate toward something that was clearly not arriving in the form he had intended. "I wanted to say it before today, not in a courtroom." "Say what?" she asked, and her voice was level, because she had learned the discipline of level in rooms where she could not afford anything else, and it had become simply how she spoke in moments of great consequence. He looked at her, straight at her with the particular directness of a man who had run out of alternative approaches. "I loved you," he said. "In the beginning. That was real." The gallery noise moved around them. 2 men talked near the window. Carr shuffled papers at the table. The world continued its business at the ordinary volume. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel Ashford, at the man she had married, and watched, and documented, and spent 3 years quietly defeating. And she thought about the first winter when she had understood what she had married into. And she thought about the rehearsed proposal notes in his riding coat. And she thought about his hand on the small of her back at the wedding. And she thought about the single honest question she had never been able to answer. Had it been real? She had believed once that it was. She had chosen to believe it because the alternative that the warmth of the early months had been entirely performance was a thing she had not been ready to accept. She still was not entirely certain. What she was certain of was that it did not change what had happened afterward. "I believe you," she said. Something moved in his face. "I believe that what you felt in the beginning was real," she said. "What you did afterward was also real. Both things can be true. That is the part you have never understood." She kept her voice level, even, without cruelty. "You loved the woman you thought I was. You made decisions about the woman you thought I was. You never once asked who I actually was." He stood there. "Good. I am sorry," he said, and she could not entirely determine whether he meant it or whether he had rehearsed it, and she realized for the first time that she no longer needed to know the answer. "I know," she said. She turned back to the table. Behind her, she heard him stand there for a moment longer. Then she heard him move away, and the recess noise closed back around the space he had occupied. And she stood at the plaintiff's table and put her hand in her pocket and felt the dollar bill and held it there and breathed. Done, she thought. That part is done. The Beaumont matter took 40 minutes. Aldous Beaumont's counsel presented the letter of credit instrument and the correspondence between Nathaniel and the Beaumont family over the preceding year, in which Nathaniel had represented the development rights as uncontested and the management transfer as valid. He had made those representations in writing in letters that Beaumont's counsel had obtained, and that were now on the record. The misrepresentation was clear. Nathaniel's counsel Holt Still at the table, still operating with professional competence. Even in a morning that had gone entirely against him, argued mitigation. He argued that Nathaniel had believed the instruments were valid, that his representations had been made in good faith, that the Whitmore challenge had not been anticipated. Alderman looked at Holt with the expression of a man whose patience was extensive, but not infinite. "Mr. Holt," he said, "your client filed forged documents and simultaneously borrowed against the rights those documents purported to convey. This court has just voided the documents as fraudulent. Are you arguing that the borrowing was made in good faith?" Holt paused for precisely the right amount of time. "I am arguing," he said carefully, "that the Beaumont action is a civil matter between private parties and that the terms of relief should be negotiated between those parties rather than determined by this court." Alderman considered that. "That is a reasonable argument," he said, which surprised the room slightly. "This court will not determine damages in the Beaumont matter today. However, the factual basis of the misrepresentation is established by this morning's primary ruling and is not available for relitigation. The parties will negotiate with that fact as their starting point." He looked at Beaumont's counsel. "Is that acceptable to your client?" Beaumont's counsel conferred briefly with Aldous Beaumont. "Acceptable, Your Honor." Alderman looked at Holt. "Mr. Holt." Holt looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel, for the second time that morning, looked at the table. "Acceptable," Holt said. The gavel came down. Outside in the summer heat, the courthouse steps had the quality of a scene that had not quite finished composing itself. People moved in clusters, talking in the particular low, urgent way of those processing a significant event. Mercer was speaking with two men, Eleanor recognized as county landowners, his document case under his arm, and his expression containing the controlled satisfaction of a professional who had achieved exactly what he had set out to achieve. James was at the bottom of the steps with the carriage. He had heard enough through the open courthouse doors, Eleanor suspected, to know the shape of the morning. He tipped his hat when she came through the door, and that was all because that was James. Thomas Webb appeared at her left shoulder. "The Philadelphia Consortium," he said without preamble. "Foss left for Philadelphia this morning, before the ruling." Eleanor looked at him. "He knew. He had good sources," Thomas said. "He pulled out clean. He's not a party to the proceeding." A pause. "He sent a message, though, to Mercer's office. His man brought it before 8. "What did it say?" Thomas produced a folded note from his coat. Eleanor opened it. It was brief and written in the direct hand of a man who had been in commerce long enough to know that concision was a form of respect. "Madam Whitmore, I have withdrawn from the Ashford transaction. I understand the property in question is yours by right. I have some interest in the river access development under legitimate terms, if you are ever disposed to discuss it. G. Foss, Philadelphia." Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket beside the dollar bill. She stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the Richmond street below the horses and carts and the two arguing men who had been at the corner on Friday and were apparently still at the corner today, still arguing about whatever it was they could not resolve. And she thought about 41,000 acres with her name on every deed, and she thought about a river access point her father had decided was not yet worth developing, and she thought about Dorothea Vance's letter on the writing table and the ideas she had been building for 3 years about what the Whitmore land could be used for. She thought about Nathaniel's face when he said, "I loved you." She thought about her own voice saying, "I believe you," and meaning it, and knowing that it did not change a single thing that needed to change. She thought about the dollar bill in her pocket. Patience Greer appeared at her right. She had been in the gallery throughout. Eleanor had not tracked her specifically, but had been aware of her presence, the way you were aware of a steady thing at the edge of your vision. She stood beside Eleanor now and looked at the street below and said nothing for a moment. Then, "How do you feel?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. It deserved an honest answer. "I feel like I have finished building something," she said, "and like I don't yet know what to do with the space where the building was." Patience nodded slowly. "That feeling passes," she said. "What comes after it is better." She paused. "It took me about 3 weeks." "I'll mark it on the calendar," Eleanor said. Patience Greer looked at her. Then she laughed a short, genuine sound, and Eleanor, who had not laughed at anything in 10 days, felt something in her chest loosen by 1 more degree. "Come to dinner on Friday," Patience said. "Margaret will be there. We will not talk about any of this." "What will we talk about?" "Whatever we want," Patience said. "That is rather the point." She went down the steps. Eleanor watched her go and watched the street below and felt the morning sit on her, the ruling, and Nathaniel's face, and Alderman's gavel, and the note from Foss in her pocket, and let it be as large as it was, without making it larger or smaller than the truth. Mercer appeared at her side. "The formal recording will be complete by end of day," he said. "I'll send Carr with copies tonight. The trust instruments will be re-registered in your name first thing tomorrow." He paused. "There is one administrative matter, Ashford Hall itself. The house and immediate grounds are not part of the trust holdings. They were purchased by Nathaniel with his own capital before the marriage. The house is his." "I know," Eleanor said. "I don't want it." Mercer looked at her. "I never wanted the house," she said. "I wanted what was mine. The house was always his." She looked at the street. "He can keep it." A pause. "That is generous," Mercer said in the tone of a man who meant something slightly more complicated than the word. "It is accurate," Eleanor said. "Generous would be something I didn't owe." She picked up her gloves from where she had laid them on the step railing. "The house was his. The land is mine. Those are the facts. I don't need anything beyond the facts." Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a different tone, quieter, less professional, the voice of a man who had known her since she was 7 years old and was speaking now without the intermediary of legal practice. "Your father would be very proud of you, Eleanor." She put on her left glove. She felt the edge of the dollar bill against her wrist. "I know," she said. And she did. She went down the steps to where James was waiting with the carriage, and he held the door, and she got in, and she sat back against the seat, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself feel the full, unguarded weight of what she had done, and what she had recovered, and what she had not lost, even in the worst of it. Even at the dinner table, with 43 people laughing, had never actually lost herself. She had never lost herself. The carriage moved forward. The courthouse disappeared behind her. This time, Eleanor did not reach for the window. She had no need to look back. The formal recording was complete by 4 o'clock that Wednesday afternoon. Carr brought the copies to Gray Street in person, slightly out of breath, the leather carrying case held against his chest, with the care of a young man who understood that some documents were not simply paper. Eleanor signed the acknowledgement at the writing table, while Martha stood in the doorway, not pretending to do anything else. And when the ink dried, Eleanor set the pen down and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface of the table, and let the reality of it settle into her body like water finding its level. 41,214 acres, confirmed, registered, hers. She picked up Foss's note from where she had left it beside the trust ledger that morning and read it again. "Some interest in the river access development under legitimate terms, if you are ever disposed to discuss it." She set it down and picked up the letter she had been drafting to Dorothea Vance in Philadelphia. The second one, the detailed one. The one that had been evolving for 3 weeks as the legal situation clarified, and the shape of what came next had grown from an idea into something with dimensions. She finished it that evening, all 6 pages of it. She sealed it herself and gave it to James to carry to the post before the morning. Then she went to bed and slept without effort for the first time in 2 weeks. Thursday morning arrived with the particular quality of a day that has no obligations attached to it. A quality. Eleanor had nearly forgotten 3 years of strategic vigilance being the kind of occupation that does not take mornings off. She sat in the Gray Street garden with her tea and her father's old survey maps spread across the garden table, and she looked at the western parcel. The 4,800 acres of timber and river access that Nathaniel had tried to sell to Philadelphia, and she thought about what her father had said about that land the last time they had walked it together. Not yet, Eleanor. The timing isn't right. But it will be. She had been 17 years old, and she had looked at the river and thought her father was simply being cautious in the way that older men sometimes confused with wisdom. Now she was 27, and she understood that he had been doing what he always did, looking at the whole board rather than the immediate move. The timing was right now. The question was what right timing looked like in her hands rather than his. She was still looking at the maps when she heard the front door, and then Martha's voice, and then a second voice she recognized but had not expected. Clara Beaumont came into the garden alone. No companion, no advance notice, no careful social arrangement. She simply came through the gate the way a woman comes through a gate when she has made a decision and does not want to give herself time to unmake it. Eleanor looked up from the maps. She did not move the maps. She did not stand. "Sit down," she said. Clara sat across the table. She looked at the survey maps for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at Eleanor with an expression that had none of the pale green silk dinner quality, none of the performance, none of the careful arrangement. She looked in the garden light approximately her age, which was 23, which was younger than Eleanor had been thinking of her. "My father's settlement with Nathaniel was agreed this morning," Clara said. "Nathaniel will repay the letter of credit in installments over 18 months. Holt negotiated it." She paused. "My father accepted because the alternative was a prolonged proceeding, and he does not have the constitution for prolonged proceedings." "Is he satisfied with the terms?" "He is satisfied that it is over," Clara said. "That is not the same thing, but it is sufficient." She folded her hands on the table. "I came to tell you something." Eleanor waited. "I came to tell you," Clara said, with the particular steadiness of someone delivering a thing they have practiced, but mean, "that what I did at the dinner, the dollar, the things I said, I understood it was cruel. I allowed myself to believe that you were what Nathaniel said you were. That was my own failure of judgment, and I am not—" She stopped. "I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you to know that I know what it was." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the dollar bill in her pocket, which she had moved that morning from her glove to the pocket of her garden dress, the same place it had lived for 2 weeks, the same folded rectangle of paper that had crossed 3 courtroom sessions and 2 county lines, and 1 conversation in this very sitting room without being spent or discarded or used for anything except what Eleanor had decided from the moment she picked it up it would be used for. A reminder. "I know you know," Eleanor said. "You showed me that when you came to my sitting room, and again when you brought your father to the courthouse." She kept her voice level. Not warm, not cold. Honest. "What you did at the dinner was cruel. What you did afterward took courage. Both things are true." Clara absorbed that with the expression of a woman receiving something more nuanced than either punishment or absolution, and finding it on balance more useful than either. "The development application," Clara said. "My father asked me to ask the river access. He has some commercial connections in the shipping trade. He wondered if there was any possibility of a legitimate arrangement under your authority." Eleanor looked at the survey maps on the table. She thought about Foss's note. She thought about her father walking that western boundary and saying, "Not yet." She thought about Dorothea Vance in Philadelphia, and the letter she had sent last night, and the 6 pages of ideas that had been growing for 3 years. "Tell your father," she said, "to write to Jonathan Mercer, formally, with a specific proposal." She looked at Clara. "I am not interested in arrangements made at garden tables. I am interested in legitimate instruments between parties operating in good faith. If your father's proposal is sound, Mercer will tell me." Clara nodded once. "That is fair," she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." Clara stood. She started to say something else and then did not, which Eleanor respected. Some things did not benefit from additional words. She simply nodded again, and Eleanor nodded back, and Clara went through the garden gate, and the sound of the latch settling behind her was clean and final in the summer morning air. Eleanor looked back at the maps. The western parcel sat in the lower left corner of the largest sheet, its river boundary marked in her father's hand with the particular careful ink of a man who believed in accurate measurement. She put her finger on the boundary line and traced it slowly. Not yet. Now, she thought. Now it is time. Dorothea Vance arrived from Philadelphia 11 days later. Eleanor had not expected her to come in person. The letter had proposed a correspondence, a consultation and exchange of ideas between two women thinking about similar problems from different angles. She had not proposed a visit. But Dorothea Vance, as Eleanor discovered when the woman stepped out of the traveling coach on Grace Street with 2 trunks and a companion, and the absolute authority of someone who had decided that correspondence was insufficient, was not a woman who did things at the scale they were proposed. She was 62 years old, broad-shouldered with white hair that she wore without apology, and eyes that had the quality of someone who had been paying close attention for 6 decades and intended to continue. She looked at Eleanor when they met in the sitting room with the assessing directness of a woman who had been reading her letters for 2 years and was now checking the letters against the person. "You're younger than I expected," Dorothea said. "You're earlier than I expected," Eleanor said. Dorothea smiled. It transformed her face entirely. "I like you," she said. "Your mother told me I would. I should have believed her sooner." She sat down without waiting to be invited, which Eleanor recognized as a quality she appreciated. "Show me the maps." Eleanor showed her the maps. They sat at the writing table for 2 hours. Dorothea had brought her own documents records from the 2 charitable institutions she sat on in Philadelphia. Financial instruments letters from women in 4 cities who had been part of conversations similar to the one Eleanor had outlined in her letter. She spread these across the table alongside Eleanor's survey maps and trust ledger, and the 2 women looked at everything together with the focused attention of people who understood that the difference between an idea and a working thing was almost entirely a matter of detail. What Eleanor had proposed in the 6 pages of her letter was this: the Whitmore land, specifically a portion of the home estate outside Richmond, not the western timber parcel, which had its own commercial development to consider, could be organized as a working institution. A place where women in the specific category of Eleanor's experience, women who had been displaced, legally maneuvered, left without resource by men who had controlled the instruments of their security, could learn to manage property, understand legal instruments, correspond with attorneys, build the kind of documented knowledge that Eleanor had spent 3 years building in secret because there had been nowhere to learn it openly. Not charity, not shelter. Something more rigorous and more permanent than either. A school in the serious sense, the sense where the subject being taught was power, and the students were women who had been told they had no aptitude for it. Dorothea had read the letter 3 times, she said. She had shown it to 2 women in Philadelphia who ran institutions of a different kind. Both of them had written back with the same 2 words: finally. "When? The western parcel," Dorothea said, looking at the river boundary. "The access development." "I am in early discussions," Eleanor said. "If the commercial arrangement is sound, the revenue from the river access would provide ongoing operating income for the institution. The land itself, the home estate, is the physical foundation. The river is the financial one. And the legal basis," Dorothea said. "For operating an institution of this kind, women teaching women property law and legal documentation and financial instruments in 1815, Virginia, is not illegal," Eleanor said. "It is unusual. It will be opposed. It will require careful construction." She looked at Dorothea steadily. "I have some experience with careful construction." Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, a large, unrestrained sound that filled the sitting room and brought Martha to the doorway to see if something had broken. "Yes," Dorothea said. "I believe you do." She looked back at the maps. "I can bring 3 women from Philadelphia who have legal training of one kind or another. Not formal women, don't have formal legal training, but practical. The kind that comes from fighting your own cases and winning." She put her finger on the home estate boundary. "How much land are we talking about?" "For the institution itself, about 400 acres initially, room to expand. And the house. The Whitmore home house has been closed since my father died," Eleanor said. "It has 12 rooms, a full working kitchen, a library that my father spent 30 years building." She paused. "The library alone is worth the trip." Dorothea put both hands flat on the table. "I want to see the house," she said. "I know," Eleanor said. "We go on Saturday." They went on Saturday. James drove them the 12 miles from Richmond to the Whitmore home estate in the late morning, and Eleanor sat in the carriage and watched the land she had grown up on come back to her through the window in the way that country comes back to people who have been away from it. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one familiar before the next one arrives. Dorothea did not speak much during the drive. She looked out her window and thought her own thoughts, which Eleanor respected. She was not a woman who needed to fill silence, and neither was Eleanor, and the two of them sat companionably in the moving carriage with the Virginia summer coming through the windows, and Eleanor thought about the last time she had made this drive. Her father's funeral, 6 years ago. She had been 21, and she had sat in this same carriage with Mercer on one side and an empty seat on the other, and she had watched the estate come back to her through the window and had understood in the full weight of that particular morning what she had inherited and what it meant and what her father had been preparing her for. He had not known specifically about Nathaniel. He had not known the particular form that the test would take. But he had known in the way of a man who understood property and power, and the specific vulnerabilities of women who held both in a world arranged by men, that a test would come. He had built the trust instruments accordingly. He had spent 20 years teaching her accordingly. She had not wasted the teaching. The carriage turned onto the estate drive. Dorothea sat forward. The house had been closed, but not neglected. Mercer had overseen a small maintenance staff through the 6 years of closure, per the trust instructions, and the result was a building that had the quality of something sleeping rather than abandoned. Eleanor unlocked the front door herself with the key that had been on the Gray Street writing table since her father's death, and the house opened around them with the particular smell of old wood and paper and the 60 years of accumulated life that made some houses feel, when you entered them, like walking into a very long sentence that had not yet finished. Dorothea stood in the main hall and turned slowly. She looked at the ceiling and the staircase and the library door, standing open at the end of the hall, with her father's books visible inside. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." Eleanor looked at her. "Yes," Dorothea said again. "This is exactly right." She turned to face Eleanor. "I want to bring the 3 women I mentioned. I want them to see this house. I want them to stand in that library and understand what we are building and why it matters." She put her hand briefly on Eleanor's arm, firm, deliberate, the touch of a woman making a commitment. "We will need 6 months to organize the first term, maybe 8, but we will open." "We will open," Eleanor said. It was the first time she had said it out loud to another person, and the sound of it in the air of her father's house made it real in a way that it had not been real inside her own head, where it had lived for 3 years as a plan. Now it was a thing she had said, a thing that could be held to. The months that followed had a different quality than the months before. Before, Eleanor had been building in secret, quiet correspondence, careful documentation, the exhausting discipline of a woman operating without visibility by necessity. Now she was building in the open, which was different in ways she had not entirely anticipated. It was louder. It attracted opinion. It attracted specifically the opinions of men who felt that what she was proposing was either dangerous or unnecessary, and sometimes both simultaneously, and who expressed these opinions in the particular tone of men who expected the expression of an opinion to be sufficient to stop the thing they were opining about. It was not sufficient. Mercer handled the legal instruments for the institution's charter with the same methodical precision he had brought to the trust recovery. Every document triple-checked, every provision drafted to withstand the specific objections that could be predicted and several that could not. Eleanor handled everything else. She corresponded with Dorothea weekly. She met with Thomas Webb about the Western Parcel development. Aldous Beaumont's shipping connections had produced a legitimate proposal that Mercer had reviewed and found sound, and the river access negotiation was moving through its careful stages toward a formal agreement that would, when concluded, provide exactly the operating income Eleanor had projected. She met with Patience Greer, who had agreed to teach a course in practical legal documentation, not law, as the law did not permit women to teach law, but documentation, which was a distinction with enough space in it to be useful. She met twice with Judge Alderman, who had retired from the circuit bench in the fall and was living in Richmond, and had expressed through Mercer an interest in the institution's library development. He came to the Whitmore estate on a Tuesday morning in October and spent 4 hours in the library, and said when he was leaving that he had a collection of legal records from his 30 years on the bench that he would be glad to donate if Eleanor thought they would be of use. "Every woman who studies here," Eleanor said, "will know how to read those records." Alderman looked at her with the direct assessment she had first seen across a courtroom bench in August. "Good," he said, and left. She did not hear from Nathaniel directly after the courthouse steps. She heard about him occasionally through the ordinary circulation of county information that he had moved from Ashford Hall to rented rooms in Fredericksburg, that Holt had concluded their professional relationship, that the Commonwealth prosecutor's review of the forgery referral had resulted in a formal inquiry that was ongoing as of November. She did not track these developments carefully. They were not her business to track. What happened to Nathaniel Ashford was Nathaniel Ashford's business, and the prosecutor's business, and the business of the law he had arranged against himself. And Eleanor had said what she had to say to him on the courthouse steps, and found after that Wednesday that she had nothing more. She did not feel guilty about this. She had examined the question of guilt carefully. She was constitutionally inclined toward careful examination, and had concluded that guilt required a debt, and she did not owe Nathaniel Ashford a continuing emotional investment in his fate. She had told him the truth on the courthouse steps. She had written the letter to the prosecutor's office, noting that her primary objective had been satisfied. She had returned Ashford Hall to him without contest because it was his. She had done what honesty required. What came after that was his to carry. The first term opened in March of 1816. 14 women, ages ranging from 19 to 58. They came from 4 counties and 2 states, and they came through different doors. Some had heard about the institution through Dorothea Vance's Philadelphia connections, some through Patience Greer's network, some through Margaret Holloway, who had been telling people about it with the relentless precision of a woman who believed in a thing and intended to make sure everyone she knew believed in it too. The morning of the first day, Eleanor stood in the main hall of the Whitmore house and looked at 14 women settling into their seats in the large room that had been her father's study, the room with the best light, the one he had used for serious work, the one she had learned to read in, sitting on the floor beside his desk while he went through the trust ledger and explained each line, and she felt the particular sensation of a thing arriving at its intended shape. Not the shape she had imagined it in the early years of her marriage, when it had been only an idea without architecture. The real shape. The one that had been built out of specific materials. Mercer's legal precision. Dorothea's Philadelphia connections. Patience. Greer's 30 years of practical knowledge. Thomas Webb's accurate surveys. James's quiet watchfulness. Martha Slade's firm management of who was and was not admitted to the Grace Street sitting room at various critical moments, and her own 3 years of patient documentation in a house that was never going to be her home. She looked at the 14 women and she thought, this is what the patience was for. The first lesson was taught by Patience Greer. It was about how to read a land deed, how to identify the operative clauses, the succession provisions, the language that could be used against you if you didn't know it was there. Patience stood at the front of the room with a deed spread on the table and talked about it, the way you talked about something you had learned at considerable personal cost and were passing forward because the cost had been high enough that someone else should benefit from it. Eleanor sat in the back of the room and listened. She had read hundreds of deeds. She could have taught this lesson herself. She sat in the back and listened anyway, because there was something in the act of sitting in this room in this house with these 14 women that she wanted to experience as a student, and not only as a builder. She wanted to know what it felt like to receive the thing she had made. It felt, she discovered, like something her father would have recognized. Like the particular satisfaction of a man, a woman who had planted trees and lived to sit in their shade. In April, a letter arrived from Gerard Foss in Philadelphia. The river access negotiation had concluded in March. Aldous Beaumont's shipping connections had formalized their proposal. Mercer had concluded the instrument review, and the agreement had been signed with Eleanor's signature and notarized and registered, all without incident, all without a single forged document, or misrepresented right, or borrowed against asset that did not exist. The agreement was clean. The revenue it would generate was exactly what Eleanor had projected. Foss's April letter was separate from the commercial matter. It was brief, written in the same direct hand as his August note. He had heard through Philadelphia connections about the institution at the Whitmore estate. He wrote 20 years old, who had been asking questions about property and legal instruments that he did not know how to answer satisfactorily. He wondered if the institution accepted students from outside Virginia. Eleanor wrote back the same day. Yes, she wrote. The institution accepts students from any state. The next term begins in September. Please have your daughter write to Mrs. Dorothea Vance in Philadelphia, whose address I enclose. She sealed the letter and gave it to James and went back to the writing table, where she had 3 more letters to answer and a revised curriculum document to review before Patience Greer arrived at 2 o'clock. She worked through the afternoon with the focused, unhurried attention of a woman who had enough to do and knew exactly what all of it was for. One evening in May, Eleanor sat alone in her father's library after the day's work was done. The house was quiet. The students had gone for the evening. Dorothea was in Richmond with Margaret Holloway. Patience Greer had left at 4. Martha had gone to her rooms. The house held the particular quality of a place that had been fully used for a day and was now resting satisfied with itself. Eleanor had the trust ledger open on the desk. Not because she needed to check the numbers, she knew the numbers, but because she had been in the habit of opening it at the end of significant days since her father had first placed it in her hands, and it was a habit she saw no reason to break. She looked at the columns and the figures and the 41,000 acres with their names and their histories and their legal descriptions, and she felt them as a weight that was not a burden. A weight like the weight of something real in your hands, something that has substance and heft and is yours to carry because you have demonstrated that you know how. She reached into her pocket and took out the dollar bill. She had been carrying it for 9 months. Through the legal proceedings, and the institution charter, and the first term, and the river access negotiation, and the letter from Foss. Through the Wednesday ruling, and the courthouse steps, and the conversation with Clara in the garden. Through every morning at the writing table, and every evening in this library, and every night in the upstairs room of the Gray Street house, and later the Whitmore homeroom when she had moved back to the estate in January. 9 months. The same folded rectangle of paper slightly soft at the creases. Now the ink a little faded from the warmth of her pocket. She set it on the desk beside the trust ledger. She looked at them side by side, the dollar and the ledger, and she thought about Clara's face when she placed it on the plate, and the sound of 43 people laughing, and Nathaniel's laugh loudest of all, and the moment she had decided before she was fully standing, before she had smoothed her dress or taken a step toward the door, that the note was not an ending. That it was in the specific vocabulary of everything she had been building for 3 years a beginning. She had been right. She thought about what she would do with it now that the thing it had marked was complete. She had thought about this before at the courthouse in the garden with Clara in the library on difficult evenings when the building felt slow and the opposition felt loud. She had always known in a general way what she would do with it eventually. She picked it up. She crossed the library to the small iron box her father had kept on the lower shelf for documents of particular significance. Survey papers, original correspondence, the handwritten notes from his grandfather's first Whitmore land purchase in 1752. She opened the box. She laid the dollar bill inside flat, beside the oldest papers, beside the document that had started all of it. She closed the box. She went back to the desk and picked up her pen. She had a letter to write to a woman in Kentucky, a widow 40 years old, who had contacted the institution through Patience Greer's network with a specific and difficult situation involving a contested inheritance and a county clerk who had misrepresented the filing requirements. The woman's name was Ruth Calloway. She had 2 daughters. She had been managing her late husband's farm for 3 years without knowing she had the legal standing to register it under her own name. Eleanor knew exactly what to tell her. She had learned it the long way through 3 years of careful building in the dark, and she was going to write it down in plain language that Ruth Calloway could carry into whatever county office she needed to walk into and use. She wrote for an hour. She answered every question Ruth had asked, and several she hadn't thought to ask yet. She told her about the specific instruments she would need, the specific language that would and would not serve her, the name of the examiner in Louisville, who could be trusted, and the name of the attorney in Lexington, who could not. She told her that the institution had a second term beginning in September, and that there was a room available if she wanted to come with her daughters. She sealed the letter and set it on the corner of the desk for morning. She looked at the iron box on the lower shelf. $1. 9 months. 41,000 acres. 14 women in the first term. A river access agreement in good standing. A library that Judge Alderman's records had expanded by 300 volumes. A second term beginning in September with 22 students confirmed and a waiting list for the third. A woman in Kentucky named Ruth Calloway, who did not yet know she was about to receive a letter that would change the specific shape of her next year. Eleanor Whitmore put down her pen, folded her hands on the desk, and sat in her father's library in the house that had always been hers, surrounded by the land that had always been hers, in the life that she had built with full deliberation from the raw materials of everything that had been done to her. They had given her $1. She had known from the moment she folded it against her knee that they had given her something they could not afford to lose. Not the dollar. The proof. The public witnessed 43-person proof of exactly what kind of men they were and exactly what kind of woman they had underestimated. She had taken that proof into every room that mattered, and she had used it with the precision her father had taught her, and she had built with it something that would outlast every name in that dining room, including in the way that mattered most, her own. The Whitmore name would not end with Eleanor. It would not end with a deed or a charter or a legal instrument, though all of those things would carry it forward. It would end eventually the way all names ended. But before it would pass through the hands of every woman who had sat in that study and learned to read a deed and walked out of the Whitmore estate, knowing something she had not known when she arrived. That was the inheritance Eleanor Whitmore had decided to leave. Not acres, not revenue, not legal instruments, however carefully drafted. The knowledge of how to stand in a room full of people who have decided you are worth nothing, and know with the full, unassailable certainty of a woman who has done her homework and kept her composure and waited for exactly the right moment, that they are wrong. She blew out the lamp. She was ready for what came next.